So I'm going to talk a little bit about a proposed change to the definition of affinity, and I think there's sort of a twofold benefit to talking about this. In the context of it, I think people will get a little bit better sense of what is it that you would do with affinity that would actually be useful in an SDN controller, and then the other angle is to get some feedback on the proposal for how we're going to adapt the existing affinity definition in order to support some things in the service chaining use case. So just to review quickly, there are basically four primitives in affinity. There's the identifier, which is who is participating in this conversation or who's part of the affinity. There's the affinity group that allows you to create collectives and sort of batch apply
Can we show something?
attributes and things.
Can you show something? No?
We'll plug into the monitor.
Yeah, and you also need to share on the WebEx. On the WebEx, you'll want to share your application.
I'm going to share my desktop even when you ask me to.
Yeah, it doesn't just randomly share things on stage as well. So if you go to the WebEx icon, from there. So the bottom is
The little green and blue ball.
and share. There you go.
Yep, that works.
All right, so
Can you email the stuff savings also?
yeah, or put it on the wiki and
Yep. So kind of
Put it on the wiki with
So affinity consists of identifiers, groups, links, which are unidirectional logical links, have nothing to do with physical topology, but sort of represent the fact that A would be things would be, and then affinity attributes are things that you can put on the link. And there's some examples of some of the kinds of things that
what to do with affinity attributes. So this was in the original proposal and is sort of the definition of what are the components and how they fit together today, prior to having any kind of support that would make sense for service chaining. This is the Plexi product. This is an example of a graphical user interface that's used. The back end of it uses the REST API to talk to the SDN controller. And here's an example where this GUI tool has done virtual machine discovery, harvested a bunch of virtual machines from vCenter, and then the user has created two groups, an application server group and a web server group, and created an affinity link between the two groups. And you can see the little dialog box is adding affinity attributes to the link that is going from the app server to the web server. So that's just an example of one of the ways you can create affinity is by having a graphical user interface like this and harvesting a bunch of information from somewhere and having the user kind of drag and drop things. There's lots of other ways that tools can automatically use the REST API to create affinities, but this is just an example of the case where the user does that. So the proposed additions are, in addition to sort of the components and the relationships that we talked about earlier, we're going to add the ability for an affinity link to have an affinity link. 0 or more affinity links. Doesn't have to have one, and have one. And then we're going to introduce new affinity attributes. There's a path intercept attribute, which essentially says ignore the addressing in the packet headers and take all of this traffic and send it over to affinity group X. There's a path intercept continue, which is sort of the second stage in how you build a service chain. Once the initial redirect or path intercept has happened, it's gone through the middlebox appliances or whatever that affinity group X consists of, and then there's a second virtual function or a third or nth. We get to the path intercept continue, and I'll have a little graphical pictorial to help you understand that better. And then there's a path tap attribute, which says, in addition to sending the traffic to wherever the packet headers are sending it, also send it to the group X. So this is the previous sort of catalog of the relationships in the affinity, and the only change here is that we've said affinity links can have affinity links. So here's an example of how you might use this.
In this case, there's a Affinity group called the engineering group that consists of some Affinity identifiers that identify workstations or users or systems of some sort within the engineering group. And what this says is when the traffic is ingressing from the internet Affinity group to the engineering Affinity group, intercept that traffic, send it first to the firewall group, virtual function 1 using the path intercept Affinity, and then send it to the IES group, virtual function 2 using the path intercept continue. So if you were to set up that definition in terms of the Affinity relationships, the SDN controller should respond to that by causing the traffic to do something that looks like that. Vector off of, don't head directly to the engineering group, but go through the service chain in the requisite order, and then go to the engineering group. So one of the things that's nice about this is, once you said that's the traffic behavior pattern for the engineering group, if you add Bob to the Affinity group using a simple REST call, Bob immediately gets that service chain behavior of his traffic, and it's coming from the internet before it gets to Bob. It goes through the firewall and the IDS service. Here's sort of a little bit more complexity and kind of trying to balance between making it really busy and ugly and sort of being more general. But this shows a case where the engineering group, in addition to having a traffic relationship with the internet, also has a low hop count linked to an application group and has a high bandwidth Affinity linked to a Hadoop cluster group. And then at the same time, you can see the finance group, whenever they are sending things to the internet, it goes to this audit service, virtual function 3. Similarly, when the finance group traffic goes to the payroll Affinity group, that's tapped and sent off to the audit appliance. And then you can also see that when internet traffic is coming from the internet to the finance group, it also goes through the firewall and the IDS service chain, similar to the way the engineering group is set up. And obviously, you can generalize this and create lots more groups and affinities and intercepts and redirects and tapping things to sort of arbitrary complexity. But hopefully this introduces the basic types and explains how we can support some of the service chaining kinds of activities that people like Cisco and Context Stream and Radware are interested in doing in OpenDaylight.
So how do you, so for middle boxes that don't come up with headers, it's very clear how it is you are having in the middle box, comes back out, and you know that it's the same traffic that it was.
Yeah.
Do you just figure it in the air when the middle box comes with packet headers and say it's a new connection as far as we're concerned? Because there's nothing else we can do. Are there malaise? And I don't know, I'll ask my question later.
I would say that is a implementation detail in the kind of forwarding and rules end of things, and it's outside of the definition of affinities. We could have a really good conversation about how one would implement that, but it is... Sorry?
If you can't implement it, then, or can't implement it well, then it should affect how you describe affinities, such that we're using to make sure that's very
Right, so I doubt we want to have a deep dive into the implementation of this at this point in the meeting with this number of people, but I absolutely would love to have that conversation in depth with anyone who's interested in some other context.
This link of links model that you have at the is that just used to take an affinity link and nest some of the redirection rules inside it, or is there some other use case? I don't really understand how you...
Right,
It's a way to comment for exposure or that.
yeah, so we're trying to keep the number of primitives as small as possible and sort of the combinations as small as possible, and that seemed like the minimal change that would allow us to both say this doesn't apply to all of the traffic for a given affinity group. It's specific to the traffic, say, to the internet. So you need the original link to describe what it is that you're redirecting, and then you need a link off of it to say where is it that you're redirecting it to. So that again, this is a proposal and an idea that seems to solve this problem that, some of us are beginning to feel is the right answer, but I wanted to put it out there for the community and give people an opportunity. Is there a simpler?
I guess that there would be two approaches that I don't think that are better. Like one of them is subset affinity groups, right? So like if an affinity group needs two different links, probably should be two different affinity groups, and possibly nested. So you would make an affinity group that would be affinity group 1, but by traffic only, and then basically you would either, and I don't know how you do that policy, you would disagree with that, but the other thing you could do, right, is you would actually have different affinity links and just scope them, and they might be nested, as opposed to sort of having links. I don't know. I guess it's more or less what you did, sort of create a sub-affinity link. Is that right?
So one of the ways you might address that is affinity groups can contain affinity groups, so you could do some of that finer discrimination within the group there, and then you could have affinity links within the nested groups and kind of drop it all in an outer group container for kind of organizational purposes. Rob?
In your project proposal, there's a northbound interface to the Affinity service.
Yep.
How does that kind of reconcile with the existing controller northbound interface? Do those sit parallel, or do those potentially eventually merge? And either way, kind of how do those talk to the set of objects that the controller platform knows about?
So I guess I'm not aware that there is an individual controller northbound. I think there's the controller northbound is the union of all of the northbounds of all of the services that have northbound. So we'll become part of that.
We should have a topic which is layers in the controller, the way we draw them versus the way they are. There's a lot of confusion around what the SAL is, and if it's a layer or a piece of code or both, and northbound, whether it's a layer or a piece of code or both.
I think it's both floor wax and these are topic.
Yeah, they're kind of two northbounds. There's the northbound that controller services use, sort of the frameworks northbound, and then there's whatever those controller services export out to the orchestration and sort of export the rest.
What are your assumptions about the transport between those services in your chain?
So the goal of Affinity is to be transport independent and vendor independent and technology independent and protocol independent, so that it's just describing the relationships and saying don't send traffic to this guy without sending it through here. The how do you send traffic is completely outside the scope, and the hope and the intent is that you can sit this on top of all of the different tunneling protocols that have been invented, or raw open flow rules, or raw Broadcom SDK, or whatever it is that you like to the south. But this is absolutely intended to sit across all southbounds and all transports and be independent of that. Anything else?
Do you assume any state that needs to be kept by each one of those services that you need to control as a part of Affinity Group?
So do you mean the virtual function services? Assumption is that the transport is stateless. We drop it off at the front door and we pick it up at the back door, and what happens internal to the virtual appliance or the virtual service is okay to us.
Presumably, what something like famous grade or something you're good at, but I guess you're not talking about it. Like, it would seem useful if you're talking about Affinity service code. I guess that's part of the like, it would be useful to specify some kind of config of an Affinity mailbox. We pass that to the mailbox. And that seems, or you could if it's entirely out of scope.
I wouldn't say out of scope, just haven't thought about it much. Partly because what is a virtual function is a moving target, and Etsy, ONF, IEEE, and ODP are all independently trying to invent this stuff and not talking to each other a whole lot. So we're trying to just.
Fair enough. And the last thing I was going to ask is, what do you have target mailboxes? Are there things that you know that you use, that you put this on, that it works for?
We're just really starting to get our heads around that. So we've, as I pointed out, this is additions to the kind of affinity syntax that we have today, based on having had some early discussions with some customers that are interested in being able to do this sort of thing. But really, this is not cooked yet. This is the first proposal that seemed to make sense, and nobody could punch any holes in it. And here's a bigger audience full of smart people, and maybe one you can punch a hole in it.
Fair enough. I'm not asking these questions because I think you should be expert.
Do you have any assumption how you configure those virtual functions into the Affinity server or whatever the mechanism?
So at some level, in Affinity terms, they need an Affinity Metadata, which might be a DNS name for one or all of the N firewall appliances. It could be an IP address, it could be a MAC address, it could be some ASCII string thing that's meaningful and that the SDN controller knows how to look up in a database and resolve to some kind of packet header, something you can classify on a line.
So that means what you said, that you assume that there is some functionality in the controller that will perform that mapping, which that functionality is currently in the controller, or you assume that you will develop that functionality for the controller. Because you need to have somehow identify something as a virtual function, something that some properties of that virtual function, address, way to go there, way to come back, whatever the parameters of that virtual function. Who will do that?
I think it's still being figured out in kind of the NFV world, but at some level, the configuration of the virtual appliance box and kind of the policies and state that are internal to that are outside the scope of Affinity. Affinity is...
Yeah, but you need to have that before you bring that, because it's useless without all those mechanisms, because you have no way to find out where those virtual functions are and how to access them. So you will need that anyway, somehow, if you bring that as a project, right?
So for example, the Radware proposal, they have one or more middle box appliances that they'd like to have traffic redirected through, and they could probably tell you all kinds of things about how you configure those middle boxes and what's interesting in terms of that. And it's outside the scope of Affinity. All we care about is what's the IP address that we deliver it to.
Yeah, but you need a connection between, let's say, Radware, box inside the controller, whatever that means, and your Affinity server, whatever. What is that connection? And how you get that info from
Host
there?
tracker? Is that the question? How do you know that 10.1.1.1 is a Radware box and it's in the network and I can send
I
traffic?
know. You will need to go to the right place with the right parameters, with the right API. I haven't seen that defined within the controller. Forget now about how you talk to others. Within the controller, how do you find out to whom you go? Because there are some Radware boxes, there are maybe some Cisco boxes, there are maybe some others
So
with
you-
different addresses.
You give the Radware boxes IP addresses, you create an affinity group that includes all those IP addresses, and you redirect things to that affinity group.
And how do you know that Radware boxes support Affinity? Do they need any other configuration for that? Do they need any support, for example? I don't know.
No, they just, traffic shows up, goes into the box, and they do their thing.
I think it's a little too simplistic.
So this is one of the pieces that you would
I
need
don't
to
know.
implement network functions virtualization. It's not the entire solution. It's the transport redirect piece of the solution.
Yeah, I still don't understand from the system. Maybe I know we can
But let's
solve
talk
it separately,
offline for a second.
because I don't understand how in a system it works.
Okay. Thank you.